The millionaire was shocked to discover that his son sold his car to buy something shocking. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's begin. Edward Martin had always been a methodical man. As the CEO of a tech and industrial automation company based in Austin, Texas, he learned early on that control was his greatest ally. Since his wife's passing 10 years prior, his life had revolved around two things: the growth of his business and the well-being of his only son, Caleb. At 12 years old, Caleb was sensitive and curious, with a quiet intelligence and an intense passion for drawing scenes that seemed to come from some parallel universe. Edward was proud of the boy, though at times he felt too distant from his emotions. In recent months, things seemed to have stabilized. The pain of the past had given way to a balanced routine, divided between the father's professional commitments and the private school where Caleb studied. On weekends, the two would cook together, assemble jigsaw puzzles, or play video games. The house that once seemed cold and silent now echoed with laughter. The Saturday sun was already illuminating the mansion in Westlake Hills, one of Austin's most exclusive areas. Edward awoke to the light filtering through the slats of the blinds. He glanced at the clock, 7:30 a.m. Even on weekends, his body couldn't rest beyond that hour. The habits of a businessman, he put on his navy blue silk robe, a gift from the last Father's Day, and went down the stairs toward the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Normally, Miss Zoe, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for over 15 years, would be there making scones and fresh juices. But on Saturdays, she had the day off. It was the day when father and son took over the kitchen. He passed through the living room with its designer furniture, a blend of comfort and sophistication. On the walls hung abstract paintings chosen by his late wife, Renata, who had been an art curator before she passed away. The duplex penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of one of the most exclusive buildings in the Texas capital, with a panoramic view of the Texas Hill Country. For many, it was the ultimate symbol of success. For Edward, it was merely the backdrop to an incomplete life. Before reaching the kitchen, Edward felt a sudden urge to check something in the garage. An intuition, perhaps. He changed his course and went down another flight of stairs, keying in the access code on the reinforced door. The spacious area housed 3 vehicles, the black Range Rover he used daily, the company car available for his driver and, or rather, it was supposed to house the third, but the empty space between the 2 concrete columns was not a trick of perception. His fully restored 1974 Chevrolet Chevelle SS had vanished. Edward blinked several times, as if the gesture could make the car reappear. He took a few steps toward the empty space, touching the air where his personal treasure should have been. That Chevelle was more than an automotive relic. It was a gift from his father, also a businessman, who had left it to him as an inheritance before he passed. The vehicle had been completely restored, maintaining its original features but with a few modern touches to its internal systems. Its metallic blue paint shone like new, as did the chrome details. It was a true gem. The businessman felt his heart race. Instinctively, he thought of theft. He checked the electronic garage gate. It was working normally. He examined the locks and security systems. No sign of a break-in. The garage was monitored by security cameras that seemed to have recorded nothing unusual in the last 24 hours. His first call was to Peter, his former driver and trusted friend, who now acted as a sort of personal assistant. "Peter." "Good morning," Edward said, trying to remain calm. "I need you to come to my house now. It's urgent." Peter Henry Scott was 45 and had worked with Edward for over a decade. He was a man of average height, with graying hair and unquestionable loyalty. Before working for the Martins, he had been a police officer, which gave him a keen eye and a natural investigative ability. "Did something happen to Caleb, sir?" Peter asked, concerned. No. Caleb is fine. It's the Chevelle. It's gone." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, gone? Did someone take it?" "I have no idea. There are no signs of a break-in. I need you to check the cameras, the gate logs, everything. And be discreet. I don't want to alarm Caleb or the condo's security team just yet." Peter promised to arrive in less than 20 minutes and hung up. Edward went back up to the penthouse, trying to reorganize his thoughts. The last time he had seen the car was on Thursday night, when he had driven it himself to the supermarket to buy ingredients for dinner with Caleb. It was a ritual he maintained, using the Chevelle for short outings, keeping the engine running smoothly. The car stayed in the garage most of the time, but it wasn't just a display piece. Upon entering the kitchen, he found Caleb already making coffee. The boy had his mother's green eyes and Edward's brown hair, a combination that often drew sighs from teachers and his classmates' mothers. "Good morning, Zaza." Edward tried to sound natural as he watched the boy select fruit for juice. "You're up early today." "I have a science project to finish," Caleb replied, without looking up from the oranges he was cutting. "I thought I'd get a head start before we play video games later." Edward nodded, trying to spot anything different in his son's behavior. But Caleb seemed the same as always, focused, responsible, a bit quiet. He decided not to mention the car's disappearance yet. There was no reason to worry the boy with something that probably had a simple explanation. While they had breakfast, they talked about school, a new game Caleb wanted to try, and plans for the approaching summer break. Edward's phone vibrated. It was Peter, letting him know he was arriving. "Son, I need to take care of a work matter with Peter. He's on his way over. Will you be okay on your own for a bit?" Caleb shrugged. "Sure, Dad. I'll be in my room finishing my project." Edward watched his son go up the stairs with a strange sense of suspicion. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Why would he suspect his own son? Peter arrived promptly, carrying his personal laptop and a small device for extracting data from the house's security systems. The two went down to the garage. "I've already remotely accessed the recordings from the last 48 hours, Peter reported as he opened his computer. "But I want to check if there's been any tampering with the local files." For 2 hours, they investigated meticulously. Peter discovered something intriguing. According to the entry system data, the gate had been activated early Friday morning at 3:17 a.m. An isolated event, with no other record of vehicles entering or leaving. The bigger surprise came when he found that the internal garage camera had been turned off exactly 3 minutes before the recorded time. "This wasn't the work of amateurs," Peter commented, frowning. "Someone knew exactly what they were doing, but who would have access to the security codes?" Edward ran his hands through his hair, worried. "Only you, me, and Ms. Zoe know the garage password." Peter hesitated before answering. "Yeah, and Caleb?" Edward looked at his friend, surprised. "Caleb, he's 12 years old, Peter. Why would he—" "I'm not accusing anyone." Peter raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "I'm just exploring possibilities. We need to consider all scenarios." The businessman reluctantly agreed. Indeed, Caleb knew the access codes. Edward had shared all the passwords with his son in case of an emergency. The boy also had a passion for technology and programming, an inheritance from the environment in which he grew up. "I'll keep investigating," Peter said. "I'll check the condominium's cameras, contact some acquaintances in the police without filing a formal complaint yet. Do you think I should include the possibility of it being an inside job?" Edward felt a lump in his throat. "Do whatever is necessary, but be discreet. If someone from the staff is involved, I don't want to scare off the culprit." During lunch, Edward watched Caleb more closely. The boy was quieter than usual, eating without much enthusiasm. When he tried to start a conversation, he received monosyllabic answers. "Is everything okay, son? You seem worried." Caleb looked up from his plate. "I'm just tired. I stayed up late watching videos last night." "What kind of videos?" "Documentaries," the boy answered quickly. Perhaps too quickly. In the late afternoon, Peter returned with more information. The condominium's cameras had recorded a blue Chevelle leaving at 3:22 a.m. on Friday. The image was low quality due to the nighttime lighting, but it was unmistakably Edward's car. The driver, however, could not be identified. "I got in touch with someone at the toll authority," Peter said, showing some notes. The car went through the toll on US Route 183 at 4:05 a.m., heading towards Austin Bergstrom Airport. Edward felt his blood run cold. "Do you think it might have been taken out of state?" "It's possible, but I don't think so. Given the time and direction, it seems like whoever took the car knew exactly where they were going." That night, Edward had trouble sleeping. He tossed and turned in bed, analyzing all the possibilities. A planned theft, a former employee with access to the passwords, someone from the condominium security. The hypotheses seemed endless, and each one more unlikely than the last. Around 2:40 a.m., he heard a noise from the hallway. He got up silently and opened his door a crack. The light in Caleb's room was still on. He approached carefully and heard his son talking on the phone in a low voice. "It's already done, there's no going back," Caleb was saying. "He's going to find out sooner or later, but it'll be worth it." Edward felt a chill. Who could his son be calling at this hour, and what were they talking about? He resisted the urge to burst into the room and demand an explanation. He needed more information before confronting Caleb. The next morning, Sunday, Edward woke up determined to find out what was happening. He went down to the kitchen and found Miss Zoe, who had arrived early to prepare lunch. "Good morning, sir," the woman smiled, placing a cup of coffee on the table. "You look like you didn't sleep well." "Zoe, have you noticed anything different about Caleb's behavior in the last few weeks?" The housekeeper, a middle-aged black woman with perceptive eyes, seemed to reflect for a moment. "Well, he's been spending more time on the computer. I thought it was for school. Is that all?" "Well," she hesitated. "A few days ago, I found him going through some old boxes in the attic, the ones with Miss Renata's things. When I asked what he was looking for, he said it was for a family project." Edward frowned. The boxes with Renata's belongings had been practically untouched since her death. It was too painful for him to rummage through those memories. After breakfast, Edward discreetly went up to the attic. The space was organized, but he could see that some boxes had been moved recently. He opened one and found photo albums, letters, and documents. Everything seemed to be in place. It was then that he noticed a thin folder, half hidden between two larger boxes. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings and brochures from an institution called the Tomorrow House. The clippings showed Renata smiling, surrounded by children. The headlines spoke of social programs, fundraising, and the work of an NGO dedicated to sheltering vulnerable children. In one of the photos, a woman with curly hair appeared next to Renata. The caption identified her as Dr. Letitia Ferrer, coordinator of the Tomorrow House. Edward felt a wave of conflicting emotions. How had he never known about his wife's volunteer work? Why had Renata never mentioned this important part of her life? Or perhaps she had, and he, always busy with his expanding company, hadn't paid proper attention. Flipping through more documents, he found donation certificates in Renata's name, dated the year before her death. The amount donated was significant, $250,000. Edward didn't remember approving this transfer, although the couple had always kept separate accounts. Renata had her own income as an art curator and received a generous allowance from her wealthy family in New York. Coming down the stairs with some of the documents in hand, Edward met Caleb in the hallway. The boy looked startled to see his father coming from the attic. "What were you doing up there, Dad?" he asked, his voice trying to sound casual. Edward decided to be direct. "I found some documents about your mother's volunteer work. Did you know about this, Caleb?" The boy looked away, nervously fiddling with the hem of his shirt. "I found out a little while ago. I wanted to know more about Mom." "And why didn't you ask me?" "You never talk about her." The reply came out more accusatory than Caleb probably intended. "Whenever I try to ask, you change the subject." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. It was true. Talking about Renata was still too painful, even after 10 years. "Son, he began, but was interrupted by the doorbell. It was Peter, with news about the investigation. Edward asked Caleb to go to his room, promising they would continue their conversation later. The boy obeyed, but his eyes betrayed a mix of relief and worry. "Mr. Martin," Peter seemed agitated, "we have a solid lead. The car was seen in Lakeway, a city near Austin, yesterday afternoon, parked in front of a title agency." "A title agency? Are you sure?" "Absolutely. An acquaintance of mine works there and recognized the vehicle. Said it caught her eye because it was an old model in excellent condition. And there's more. According to her, a transaction involving the vehicle was being processed." Edward's mouth went dry. "What kind of transaction?" "A transfer of ownership. The car is being sold." The businessman had to sit down. His head was spinning with this new information. Someone had not only stolen his Chevelle, but was trying to sell it legally. How was that possible without the original documents, which were kept in the safe in his office? I've managed to schedule a visit to the agency for tomorrow morning, Peter continued. They open at 9 a.m. My acquaintance will meet us discreetly before business hours, so we can check the documents that were presented. Edward thanked him, feeling a mix of gratitude and apprehension. He needed to confront Caleb about what he had discovered, but something held him back. What if he was wrong? What if his son had nothing to do with the car's disappearance? The suspicion could cause irreparable damage to their relationship. He decided to wait until the visit to the title agency. He needed concrete proof before making any accusations. In the meantime, he would watch Caleb's behavior more closely. During dinner, the atmosphere was tense. Caleb ate in silence, only answering when directly questioned. Edward tried several times to start a conversation, talking about movies, games, even school, topics that normally animated the boy, but Caleb remained distant, as if his body were there, but his mind was wandering far away. "Son, if something is bothering you, you can tell me," Edward finally said, placing his fork next to his plate. "Whatever it is." Caleb looked up, and for a moment Edward saw vulnerability and fear, but the boy quickly resumed his neutral expression. "I'm fine, Dad, just tired." Later, as he was getting ready for bed, Edward heard his son on the phone again. This time, he couldn't make out what Caleb was saying, only catching the anxious tone of his voice. Who would be helping a 12-year-old boy, and for what purpose? On Monday, Edward woke up early and drove to the title agency in Lakeway with Peter. The employee, as promised, met them before opening hours. The documents were presented on Friday, she explained, showing them a folder. Everything seemed to be in order. The transfer was registered the same day. Edward examined the papers, feeling his heart pound. There was a power of attorney with his supposed signature, authorizing the sale of the vehicle. The document looked authentic, with a notarized signature and all the necessary stamps, but he was absolutely certain he had never signed it. "This is a forgery," he declared, showing Peter. "I never signed this power of attorney." The document passed a digital verification, the employee explained. Uncomfortable. "The electronic signature matches the one registered in the system." Edward froze. His electronic signature was password protected. Very few people had access to it: his secretary at the company, his lawyer, and his personal laptop, which he occasionally left unlocked at home. "And who presented these documents?" Peter asked. The employee hesitated. "A young man, maybe in his 20s, said he was Mr. Edward Martin's assistant. He was accompanied by a boy." "A boy?" Edward felt his stomach sink. "Yes, a boy of about 12. I thought he was the buyer's son. He waited in the reception area while the older guy took care of the paperwork." Peter and Edward exchanged glances. The evidence was undeniable. Caleb was involved somehow. "And who is the buyer?" Edward asked, dreading the answer. The employee consulted the documentation. A businessman from San Antonio, Leonard Campos. Payment was made in cash, $270,000, all declared according to the law. On the way back to Austin, Edward remained silent, digesting the information. Peter, respecting his state of mind, focused on driving. The landscape of the hill country passed quickly by the window, but Edward barely noticed, lost in confused thoughts. "What should I do now, Peter?" he finally asked, as they saw the first buildings of the state capitol. "You have two options." "Senator," Peter answered calmly, "file a formal complaint for forgery and theft, which will likely result in a police investigation and possible consequences for everyone involved. Or talk to Caleb first. Understand what's happening before making any decisions." Edward nodded slowly. Deep down, he already knew which path he would take. Regardless of what Caleb had done, he was his son, his only son. He had to give him a chance to explain himself. Upon arriving home, however, he found something unexpected. An email confirming a bank transfer made that morning. The amount, exactly $270,000. The recipient, the Tomorrow House, Institution for the Support of Children and Adolescents. In the automated message there was a note: "Donation in the name of Caleb Martin, in memory of Renata Martin." Edward stood paralyzed in front of the computer screen. The confirmation of the bank transfer was like a puzzle piece that fit perfectly. yet at the same time revealed a completely unexpected picture. His first impulse was to call the bank and cancel the transaction, but something stopped him. The phrase, "in memory of Renata Martin," echoed in his mind. He picked up the phone and dialed Caleb's school. A polite voice answered on the other end. "Horizon Academy, good morning. This is Edward Martin, father of Caleb Martin from the 7th grade. I need to know if my son is at school today." "One moment, Mr. Martin. I'll check." The seconds of waiting felt like an eternity. "Mr. Martin, Caleb did not attend classes today. We haven't received any justification for his absence." Edward thanked her and hung up, feeling a wave of worry. It was the first time Caleb had missed school without his knowledge. Where could the boy be? He immediately called his son's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. "Peter," he called to his assistant, who was still in the living room. "We need to find Caleb now." "Do you think he might be at that NGO, the Tomorrow House?" Edward nodded. It was the most likely hypothesis. He quickly searched on his phone and found the institution's address. It was in the Travis Heights neighborhood, a leafy area about 20 minutes away. Without wasting time, the two got in the car and headed to the location. The drive to Travis Heights revealed the social contrast typical of large American cities. Leaving the mansions and luxury condos of Westlake Hills, they entered an older part of Austin, where historic homes coexisted with small businesses and simpler buildings. The Tomorrow House operated out of a preserved 1950s bungalow, adapted to house the institution. The well-tended garden and a colorful gate with children's drawings indicated they had arrived at the right place. Edward parked in front of the house and took a deep breath before getting out of the car. "Do you want me to go in with you, sir?" Peter asked. "No, it's better if I go alone. Stay here and call me if you see Caleb leaving." When he rang the doorbell, Edward was greeted by a young woman with a welcoming smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "Good morning. My name is Edward Martin. I'm looking for my son, Caleb. I believe he might be here." The young woman's expression changed, as if she recognized the name. "One moment, please. I'll get Dr. Ferrer." Edward waited in the reception area, looking at the walls decorated with children's drawings and photographs of activities held by the institution. Among them, some old pictures caught his eye. He moved closer to get a better look and felt a tightness in his chest. There was Renata, smiling, surrounded by children. The photo must have been almost 15 years old. "Mr. Martin." Edward turned to find a woman of about 50, with graying, curly hair and a penetrating gaze behind colorful glasses. He recognized her immediately from the photographs he had seen with Renata. "I'm Letitia Ferrer, coordinator of the Tomorrow House. Please come to my office." Following her down the hallways, Edward noticed the activity of children and teenagers in various activities. Some were studying in small rooms, others were participating in art workshops. The environment was simple but organized and welcoming. Letitia's office was small and functional, shelves with books and organized folders, a desk with a computer, and a few chairs. On the walls, more photographs and certificates. "I imagine you're here about the donation," Letitia began, gesturing for Edward to take a seat. "Actually, I'm looking for my son. Caleb didn't go to school today, and I received a notification of a transfer to this institution." Letitia seemed surprised. "Caleb isn't here now, Mr. Martin. He visited us last week and again yesterday afternoon, accompanied by a young man who introduced himself as his cousin." "Cousin?" Edward frowned. "Say Caleb doesn't have any cousins." "I see." Letitia adjusted her glasses, visibly uncomfortable. The young man identified himself as Raphael, said he was a law student and was helping Caleb with a personal project. Edward felt his blood boil. Who was this Raphael, and how had he gained his son's trust? "Dr. Ferrer, I need to know exactly what happened. My son is only 12 years old. He couldn't make a donation of this size without my consent." The coordinator took a deep breath, as if organizing her thoughts. "Mr. Martin, when Caleb came to us, he explained that he wanted to make a donation in his mother's memory. He showed documents that seemed perfectly legal, signed by you. Raphael presented a power of attorney authorizing him to represent you in this transaction. I confess I was surprised by the amount and the donor's age, but the legal procedures seemed to be in order." "The documents were forged," Edward said flatly. I never signed any authorization. Letitia turned pale. This is extremely serious. If that's the case, we need to cancel the donation immediately. Before that, Edward raised a hand to calm her. I want to understand what motivated my son. Did Caleb mention anything about his mother and this institution? Letitia's expression softened. Yes, he said he found documents and photos of Renata's volunteer work here. He said his mother had made a large donation shortly before she passed and that he wanted to honor that legacy. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a mix of emotions, pride, sadness, guilt. Renata was one of our most dedicated volunteers, Letitia continued, her voice now softer. She worked here for almost 5 years, mainly helping in the cultural area, organizing museum visits and art workshops. The children adored her. I didn't know, Edward admitted, suddenly feeling ashamed. I mean, I knew she did volunteer work, but I never got involved, never asked for details. She was an incredible person, Letitia smiled nostalgically. When she made that large donation over 10 years ago, we were able to expand our facilities, create new workshops. That wing, she pointed out the window to a newer annex of the house, was built thanks to her. It's our Renata Martin cultural space. Edward looked in the indicated direction and saw a discreet plaque with his wife's name. How had he never known this? How had he never visited the place that kept Renata's memory alive? When your son showed up here, Letitia continued, it was like seeing a piece of Renata again. He has the same determined look, the same passion for making a difference. And what did he intend with this new donation? To expand the educational program, we have a waiting list of children who need specialized academic support. With the donated amount, we could hire more educators, buy teaching materials, tablets, computers. Edward nodded slowly, processing the information. Part of him was still furious with his son's actions, selling the car without permission, forging documents, lying. But another part was beginning to understand the motivations behind those acts. Did Caleb say where he would be today? He asked, returning to his immediate goal. Not specifically. Letitia seemed genuinely concerned. He just mentioned that today would be an important day, that he would be finalizing the details of the donation. Edward thanked her and left his card with Letitia, asking her to contact him immediately if Caleb appeared or got in touch. Before leaving, he stopped in front of the board with the old photos. May I? He asked, pointing to one of the photographs where Renata appeared. Of course. Letitia gently removed the photo from the board and handed it to Edward. Keep it. Back in the car, Edward showed the photograph to Peter and explained the situation. What do we do now, sir? We need to find this Raphael. If he's with Caleb, he probably knows where my son is. I have some contacts at the university's law school, Peter offered. If he's really a student, I might be able to locate him. While Peter made calls, Edward examined the photograph of Renata. She was smiling broadly, hugging a group of children in front of a school bus. Behind them, a banner announced, Cultural Expedition, the Blanton Museum of Art. The date in the bottom corner indicated the photo was taken just 3 months before Renata's passing. Looking more closely, Edward noticed a detail. Among the children, a boy of about 2 was in Renata's lap. Something about that child seemed familiar. Peter, he interrupted his assistant's call, can you zoom in on this part of the photo on your phone? Peter used the photo app to zoom in on the image. That boy in Miss Renata's lap, he looks a lot like Caleb when he was little. It's not Caleb, Edward said, feeling a shiver. The date doesn't match. Caleb would have been 3 here, not 2. Then who could it be? Edward didn't answer immediately. A suspicion was beginning to form in his mind, but it was too absurd to verbalize. Peter finally got a promising lead. One of his friends at the UT Austin School of Law knew a Raphael Oliver, a second-year student who often talked about volunteer work. They got his phone number, but the calls went to voicemail. Let's go to the university, Edward decided. Maybe we can find him there. The UT Austin campus was bustling with the typical Monday activity. Students hurried between buildings, while some sat on the grass enjoying the mild autumn sun. With the help of Peter's contact, they headed to the law school building. Raphael usually has classes on Monday afternoons. Peter's friend, a teaching assistant, informed them. His next class starts in half an hour. in the main auditorium. They decided to wait near the auditorium entrance. Edward felt out of place among the young university students, but his determination to find Caleb overcame any discomfort. After 20 minutes of waiting, Peter discreetly nudged his arm. "That one in the blue sweatshirt. That's him. I recognize him from the photo my friend sent." Edward watched the young man approach. Tall, thin, with curly hair and dark skin. He was carrying a backpack and talking animatedly with a classmate. He looked to be about 20. Raphael Oliver. He approached him directly as the young man passed. The young man stopped, surprised. He looked at Edward and then at Peter, a flash of recognition crossing his face. "Mr. Martin," he asked, his voice betraying nervousness, "I can explain. Where is my son?" Edward tried to keep his voice low, but the tension was palpable. Raphael's classmate discreetly moved away, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Caleb is safe," Raphael replied, adjusting the strap of his backpack on his shoulder. "He asked me not to reveal where he is until everything is settled." "Settled?" Edward took a step forward, intimidatingly. "You forged documents, sold my car without authorization, and diverted a huge sum of money. What exactly would be settled?" Raphael looked around, visibly uncomfortable with the scene that was starting to draw curious glances. "Can we talk somewhere more private?" he suggested. "I promised to explain everything." They agreed to go to a nearby coffee shop. The place was quiet at that hour, with few customers. They sat at a secluded table, Peter positioning himself strategically near the exit in case the young man tried to flee. "How did you meet my son?" Edward began, after the waiter left 3 coffees on the table. Raphael took a deep breath. "We met at the Tomorrow House, about a year ago. I volunteer there on Tuesdays and Thursdays, tutoring the teenagers. And how was Caleb attending the institution without my knowledge?" "He wasn't attending as a beneficiary," Raphael explained. "He started showing up occasionally, saying he wanted to learn about his mother's work. At first, we thought it was strange for a 12-year-old to show up alone, but he showed us photos and spoke about Miss Renata with such knowledge that we believed he had permission." Edward shook his head, incredulous. "And no one thought to call me to confirm?" "Caleb said you were aware." Raphael lowered his eyes. "He said you preferred not to come in person because it brought back painful memories. And you helped a 12-year-old boy sell a classic car and forge his father's signature." Edward's voice rose, attracting glances. "You're a law student, for God's sake." "It wasn't exactly like that," Raphael defended himself, though his tone indicated guilt. "Caleb already had everything planned when he came to me. He said it was a surprise for you, that you had talked about making a donation in his mother's name and that you had agreed." "And the forged documents," Raphael hesitated. "He already had them when he approached me. He said you had signed them but didn't want to be directly involved in the transaction. I should have been suspicious, I know, but Caleb is very convincing, and the cause was noble. Where is he now?" Edward cut off the explanation, losing his patience. "In Lakeway, at the car buyer's house." Edward felt his heart skip a beat. What is he doing there?" "Leonard Campos is a respected collector," Raphael explained quickly. "When he learned that the car had belonged to Caleb's grandfather and that the sale was for a charitable cause, he was touched. He invited Caleb to see his classic car collection and explained that he would take good care of the Chevelle." "And you let my son go alone to a stranger's house?" Edward stood up, furious. "Leonard is not a stranger." Raphael also stood, defensively. "He's a well-known businessman, owns a dealership in San Antonio. His wife volunteered at the Tomorrow House years ago. They are trustworthy people." Peter, who had been silent until then, intervened. "I'll check on this Leonard Campos immediately." He stepped away to make some calls. Edward faced Raphael, trying to control his anger. Why did Caleb do this? Why didn't he talk to me directly if he wanted to make a donation? Raphael seemed genuinely dismayed. "He tried, Mr. Martin. From what he told me, he tried several times to talk about his mother's work, about the Tomorrow House. He said you always changed the subject, that it was too painful." The words hit Edward like a punch. It was true. Whenever Caleb tried to talk about Renata or ask questions about her, Edward would deflect the conversation, afraid the emotions would overwhelm him. "And the money?" he asked, his voice more restrained. "Why so much? $270,000 is a fortune." "It was a fair price for the car," Raphael shrugged. "Leonard is a serious collector. He wouldn't agree to pay less than it's worth." Caleb insisted that the entire amount go to the Tomorrow House. Peter returned to the table, looking more relaxed. "I checked. Mr. Martin, Leonard Campos is legitimate, respected businessman, known collector, no criminal record. His wife really did volunteer at the NGO a few years ago." Edward nodded, feeling some relief. At least his son wasn't in the hands of malicious people. "Take me there," he said to Raphael. "Now." The drive to Lakeway was tense. Raphael sat in the back seat, giving directions to Peter, who was driving. Edward remained silent, trying to organize his thoughts and decide how to approach Caleb. Part of him wanted to explode with anger, demand explanations, impose severe punishments. Another part just wanted to hug his son and be thankful he was safe. During the drive, a persistent doubt bothered him. He looked again at the photograph he had brought from the Tomorrow House. "Raphael," he called, turning to the back seat, "do you know all the children served by the NGO? Most of the current ones? Yes, I've been there for almost 3 years. And the older ones, from 10, 15 years ago?" Raphael shook his head. "Some stay connected to the institution, come back to visit or become volunteers, but many move on with their lives, lose contact." Edward showed him the photograph, pointing to the boy in Renata's lap. "Do you know who this child is?" Raphael examined the image carefully. "I don't recognize him. Based on the age of the photo, he must be an adult now." Edward put the photograph away, more intrigued than before. There was something familiar about that child, but he couldn't place what it was. They arrived in Lakeway after a 40-minute drive. The city, known for its crystal-clear lake and caves with important archaeological records, had become a refuge for Austinites seeking a better quality of life outside the capital while remaining close. Leonard Campos's house was in a gated community in the most exclusive area, near the lake. Raphael announced them at the gate, and they were soon authorized to enter. The property was impressive, a contemporary mansion with large glass windows, an impeccably manicured garden, and a side garage that looked more like a showroom, with glass walls that allowed a view of the classic car collection. And there was the blue Chevelle, gleaming under the special lighting, parked between a red Karmann Ghia and a 1970s Dodge Dart. Before they reached the main door, it opened. A middle-aged man, tall and distinguished-looking, came out to greet them. Beside him, Caleb looked small, and for the first time since Edward had seen him that weekend, genuinely apprehensive. "Mr. Martin," Leonard extended his hand in greeting. "I'm Leonard Campos. I imagine we have a lot to talk about." Edward ignored the outstretched hand, his eyes fixed on Caleb. The boy took a step forward, his chin held high in a gesture that mixed defiance and fear. "Dad," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I can explain everything." "In the car, Caleb," Edward pointed to Peter's vehicle, "we're going home now." "Mr. Martin," Leonard intervened, "I know you must be furious, and rightly so. But I believe it would be beneficial for us to talk first. I'm sure there's a solution that can satisfy everyone." Edward hesitated. His impulse was to grab his son by the arm and leave immediately, but the man in front of him seemed sincerely concerned, and Edward knew that yelling at Caleb at that moment would only make things worse. 20 minutes, he conceded. "Then we're going back to Austin, and you," he pointed at Raphael, "will have to answer to the police." The student paled but nodded in resignation. They entered the house, where an elegant woman was waiting for them in the spacious, well-decorated living room. Leonard made the introductions. "My wife, Vivian Campos." The woman smiled, but her eyes revealed concern. "I've made some coffee for us. Caleb, dear, why don't you take your father to the office? Leonard and I will join you there in a minute." The boy agreed silently and led Edward down a hallway to a meeting room converted into a home office. Large windows offered a view of the lake, its waters reflecting the afternoon sky. When they were finally alone, Edward faced his son. "What were you thinking, Caleb? Do you have any idea how serious this is?" The boy didn't back down. "I know you're mad, Dad. I know what I did was legally wrong, but I was doing it for an important cause, for Mom's memory." "By forging documents?" Lying to me. Is that how you honor your mother's memory? I tried to talk to you. Caleb's voice rose. I tried several times to show you what I found out about her work, about the kids she helped. You never wanted to listen. You never want to talk about Mom. Edward felt as if something broke inside him. His son was right. For years, he had avoided the subject, as if not mentioning Renata could lessen the pain of her absence. That doesn't justify what you did, he said, calmer now. You could have insisted. You could have forced me to listen. How? Caleb shook his head, frustrated. You're always busy with the company, with meetings, trips. When you're home, we barely have a real conversation. Those words hurt more than the discovery of the sold car. Edward realized how much he had failed as a father, how much he had neglected his son's emotional needs in the name of his own pain and his work. The car, Edward took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure, was more than an object to me. It was the last connection I had with my father. I know, Caleb replied, surprisingly mature. That's why I thought it would be the perfect sacrifice. Something truly valuable, not just money we wouldn't even miss. How did you manage to forge my signature? And how did you access the documents in the safe? Caleb looked down for the first time. Your laptop password is my birthday. It wasn't hard to find the digital signature files. The documents, I got them from the safe when you traveled to New York last month. You left the combination written down in your desk drawer. Edward rubbed his face, stunned by the carelessness that had allowed all this to happen. His 12-year-old son had bypassed systems that should have been impenetrable to him. Who is that child in the photo with your mother? He asked suddenly, changing the subject. The boy in her lap. The question caught Caleb by surprise. What photo? Edward took the photograph from his pocket and showed it to his son. Caleb examined it with curiosity. I've never seen this photo before, he admitted. Nice, but I found others like it in the boxes in the attic. They were interrupted by the arrival of Leonard and Vivian, followed by Peter and Raphael. The couple brought a tray with coffee and cookies, which they placed on the central table. Leonard took the floor. Mr. Martin, before anything else, I want to apologize for my involvement in this situation. If I had the slightest suspicion that I didn't have your consent, I never would have proceeded with the purchase. Edward nodded, acknowledging the sincerity in the man's words. When your son and Raphael approached me, Leonard continued, I was touched by the story. I knew about the work of the Tomorrow House through Vivian, who volunteered there for years. The idea of acquiring a classic car while simultaneously contributing to a noble cause seemed perfect to me. You never questioned how a 12-year-old boy was selling a car, Vivian intervened. We did question it, of course. Raphael explained that you had authorized it, that it was a joint project. The documents seemed authentic. Edward turned to Raphael. And you, a law student, should know better. The young man seemed genuinely remorseful. I should have checked more thoroughly, Mr. Martin. I have no excuses. When I met Caleb at the NGO, he talked so much about his mother, about her work, that I became emotionally invested in the cause. I wanted to help. And what about the donation? Edward asked Leonard. The money has already been transferred to the institution. Yes, the businessman confirmed. I made sure to make the official payment with all the necessary records. The transaction is completely traceable and legitimate from a tax perspective. A heavy silence fell over the room. Edward looked at his son, at the couple, at Raphael. They were all waiting for his reaction, his decision. Through the window, he could see the Chevelle in the glass garage, shining under the special lights. He could demand the car back, undo the entire transaction, punish those involved. He had the legal grounds to do so, but something inside him hesitated. Caleb's words about Renata, about the Tomorrow House, about the emotional distance between father and son, all of it weighed on his conscience. I need some time, he said finally. I need to think about what to do. Leonard nodded understandingly. The car isn't going anywhere, Mr. Martin. I'll be at your disposal for whatever decision you make. As they were preparing to leave, Vivian approached Edward discreetly. Your son is extraordinary, she said in a low voice. His determination to honor his mother's memory, to do something significant. It reminds me so much of Renata. Edward looked at her in surprise. You knew my wife. We worked together at the Tomorrow House for almost 2 years, Vivian confirmed. She talked a lot about you and Caleb. There was something in Vivian's eyes, something unsaid, that intrigued Edward. But before he could question her further, Caleb approached, ready to leave. On the way back to Austin, silence dominated the car. Raphael had stayed in Lakeway, promising to be available for any necessary clarification. Peter drove, occasionally casting worried glances in the rearview mirror. In the back seat, father and son sat apart, each lost in their own thoughts. As they neared the first buildings of Austin, Caleb finally spoke. "What's going to happen now?" Edward looked at his son. The initial anger had given way to a mixture of confusion, admiration, and sadness. "I don't know yet," he answered honestly. "We need to talk. Really talk." When they arrived home, Edward asked Peter to leave them alone. The driver nodded understandingly and promised to return in the morning. In the elevator, Edward noticed that Caleb was holding something in his hands, a manila envelope. "What's that?" he asked. "Something Leonard gave me before we left," the boy replied. "He said it belonged to Mom." Edward's heart raced. More secrets, more surprises. The night was going to be long, and the revelations that envelope held would forever change Edward's understanding of his own family. The penthouse was silent when they entered. Edward placed the keys on the entry table and watched his son walk to the living room, still holding the manila envelope as if it was something precious. The boy sat on the sofa, but made no move to open it. "Are you hungry?" Edward asked, trying to break the tension. Caleb shook his head. An uncomfortable silence hung between them. Edward sat in the armchair across from his son, studying him for a few moments. "Son," he began, choosing his words carefully, "before we discuss any punishment or consequences, I want to fully understand what happened. I want you to tell me everything from the beginning. How did you find out about your mother's work at the Tomorrow House? How did you plan all of this?" Caleb took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. He placed the envelope on the coffee table and straightened his shoulders. "It started during the winter break," he explained. "You were away on a business trip. Remember, I was with Mrs. Zoe, but she had to visit her sick sister that weekend. Aunt Mariana came to stay with me." Edward nodded. Mariana was Renata's sister, the only close relative who still kept in regular contact with them. Aunt Mariana brought some old photos to show me, pictures of Mom I had never seen. In several of them, she was with children, in a place that looked like a school or an institution. When I asked, Aunt Mariana told me about her volunteer work, about how dedicated Mom was to helping children without opportunities. Caleb paused, looking at his father as if expecting a reaction. Edward just gestured for him to continue. "I got curious. I wanted to know more about this part of her life that no one had ever told me about. Aunt Mariana mentioned the name of the NGO, but she didn't know the details. She said you could tell me more." Edward felt a pang of guilt. He vaguely remembered Caleb trying to start this conversation after the holidays, and how he had deflected, saying they were late for some appointment. "I tried to ask you," Caleb continued, confirming his father's suspicions, "several times, but you always changed the subject, or said we'd talk about it another day. So you decided to investigate on your own," Edward completed. "Yes, I started by searching online. I found the Tomorrow House, saw old photos on their website where Mum appeared. One day after school, I asked the driver to drop me off at the mall, but I went there instead." "You went alone?" Edward couldn't hide his astonishment. "Why didn't you ask me to take you?" The look Caleb gave him was a more eloquent answer than any words could be. It was clear the boy didn't believe his father would have agreed. "The first time, I just walked by the front. I didn't go in, but I went back the next week. This time, I got up the courage and rang the doorbell. I said I was Renata Martin's son, and that I wanted to see the place where my mother had worked. They were very welcoming, especially Dr. Ferrer." Edward could picture the scene. His 12-year-old son alone, knocking on the door of an institution to learn about the legacy of the mother he barely had time to know. The thought broke his heart. "I started visiting regularly," Caleb went on. "After school, on days when you had late meetings, I made friends with some of the kids, met the volunteers. That's where I met Raphael. He helped me with my math homework. We talked about Mom, about her work." "And when did the idea of selling the Chevelle come up?" Edward asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "About 2 months ago. Caleb took a deep breath. The Tomorrow House was going through financial difficulties. One of their main sponsors had cut their support, and they were about to reduce the number of children they served. Dr. Ferrer seemed so worried. I remembered that Mom had made a large donation before she left us. I wanted to do the same. Edward got up and walked to the window, watching the city lights. Night had completely fallen over Austin. Why the car, Caleb? You could have asked me for money. It wouldn't have been the same, the boy answered with surprising conviction. It had to be something significant, something that really mattered, something that showed we were willing to give up something valuable for a greater cause, like Mom would have done. Edward turned to face his son, impressed by the maturity of his reasoning. And how did you come up with the whole plan? The documents, the sale, all of it? Caleb looked away, clearly uncomfortable with this part of the story. I started by researching how to sell a car. I found out I would need documents, signatures, notarization. I knew you would never agree, so... He hesitated. So you decided to go behind my back, Edward finished. I found your digital signature on your laptop. It wasn't hard. Your password is my birthday. Caleb seemed simultaneously ashamed and proud of his ingenuity. The car's documents were in the office safe. The combination was written in your planner. And how did you find the buyer? Raphael helped me with that, Caleb admitted. He knew Leonard through the NGO. He knew he collected classic cars and was looking for that specific model of Chevelle. It seemed perfect. Edward shook his head, still processing the audacity and complexity of the plan executed by his 12-year-old son. Do you realize that what you did is a crime, Caleb? Forgery of documents, fraudulent sale. If I decide to press charges, Raphael could be arrested. You could be sent to a juvenile correction facility. The boy turned pale. He clearly hadn't fully considered the potential legal consequences of his actions. Are you going to report me to the police? He asked, his voice trembling. Edward sighed deeply. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. We need to resolve this situation. But we also need to talk about trust, about honesty. You could have told me about your discoveries, about your desire to help the NGO. We could have found a solution together. Would you have listened? Caleb's question was loaded with genuine doubt, not defiance. The question hit Edward like a punch. Had he become so distant, so emotionally closed off, that his own son doubted he could be trusted with something so important? So I would have tried, he answered honestly. I can't promise it would have been easy for me to talk about your mother, about her work, but I would have tried for you. Caleb nodded slowly, seeming to absorb the answer. Then, his eyes turned back to the envelope on the table. Aren't you going to see what's inside? Edward asked, also curious about the contents. Caleb picked up the envelope and handed it to his father. I think you should open it. Edward took the envelope, feeling its weight. Whatever was inside seemed to have some volume. He carefully broke the seal and emptied it onto the table. Out fell photographs, some documents, and a handwritten letter. Renata's handwriting was unmistakable. With slightly trembling hands, Edward opened the letter. It was dated 2 weeks before the accident that took Renata from this world. My dearest Edward, the letter began. If you are reading this, it's because the time has finally come to share something with you that I have kept to myself for a long time. Edward felt his heart race. He looked at Caleb, who was watching his reactions intently. Do you want me to keep reading? He asked his son. Yes, Caleb replied, moving closer to his father on the sofa. Edward took a deep breath and continued. About 10 years ago, my work at the Tomorrow House began. What started as simple volunteering quickly became a mission. Every child I met there touched my soul in a different way, but there was one boy in particular, Edward, a baby of only a few months who arrived at the institution after losing his parents in tragic circumstances. Edward paused, feeling a strange premonition. Something about the story sounded all too familiar. His name was Michael. He had no known relatives and was destined to grow up in the foster care system, moving from one temporary home to another. Something about him captured me from the first moment. Perhaps his intelligent eyes, perhaps the way he smiled when I held him. For months I visited him almost daily. Do you remember that period when I said I was involved in a special project? It was Michael. Caleb looked at his father, confused. Who is Michael? Edward didn't answer, continuing to read, his voice now more shaky. When I learned that you and I couldn't have any more children after Caleb, something broke inside me. I loved our son more than anything, but I had always dreamed of a bigger family. That's when the idea began to form. What if we could adopt Michael? I spoke with Dr. Ferrer, started the preliminary procedures, keeping it all a secret. I wanted to surprise you when everything was underway. Edward had to stop again. The room seemed to spin around him. He looked at the photograph scattered on the table and picked one up. It showed Renata holding a baby of about 1 year old, with dark eyes and curly hair. The same baby from the other photograph he had brought from the Tomorrow House. But fate is unpredictable, the letter continued. A family from San Antonio expressed interest in adopting Michael, a wonderful couple, Leonard and Vivian Campos. They had been trying to have children for years without success. When they met Michael, it was love at first sight. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. Leonard and Vivian Campos, the same people who had bought the Chevelle from Caleb. It couldn't be a coincidence. Part of me wanted to fight, to insist on our adoption, but another part knew that Michael deserved a home immediately. He couldn't wait for me to convince you, for us to go through the whole bureaucratic process. The Campos family was ready. They had already been approved. They had a loving home waiting for him. With a broken heart, I let go. Michael went to San Antonio with his new family. Caleb was completely engrossed in the story, leaning in to see the photographs better. I kept in touch with the Campos family over the years. I received photos, updates on Michael's development. He is growing up strong and healthy, full of curiosity and intelligence. But I never stopped thinking of him as the son we almost had. One day, when the time is right, I would like for you and Caleb to meet him. I know our son would love to have a younger brother, even if they don't share the same blood or the same home. Raphael, as he was renamed by the Campos family, will always be a part of my heart, a part of our unfulfilled story. Edward let the letter fall onto the table, stunned by the revelation. Raphael. The same Raphael who had helped Caleb sell the car. The young law student who could have been his adopted son. Raphael is this baby? Caleb asked, pointing to the photograph. The Raphael who helped me? It seems so, Edward replied, trying to organize his thoughts. Your mother kept in touch with his family, but she never told me. Why didn't she tell you? Edward reflected on the question. Why had Renata kept something so significant a secret? The answer was in the letter itself. She feared his reaction, feared he wouldn't accept the idea of adoption, and, thinking honestly, he probably would have resisted at the time. They were building the company, going through difficult financial times, and they already had Caleb to raise. The idea of adding another child to the family would have seemed reckless to the pragmatic Edward of 10 years ago. I think she was waiting for the right moment, he finally answered. And then she was gone, Caleb completed, with a maturity that surprised Edward again. Father and son sat in silence for a few minutes, each absorbing the revelations in their own way. Edward examined the other photographs, Raphael growing up, at different ages, always with Leonard and Vivian by his side. The last photo showed a teenager of about 15, clearly recognizable as a younger version of the young man they had met. Did the Campos family know who we were when Caleb showed up selling the car? Edward asked aloud, more to himself than to his son. Leonard recognized me immediately, a voice said from the living room doorway. They both turned, startled. Raphael was standing there, his expression serious and emotional. Beside him, Ms. Zoe looked embarrassed. Sorry, sir, the housekeeper said. He insisted it was urgent, said he had something important to explain. Edward nodded, dismissing Zoe with a gesture. The woman withdrew discreetly, closing the living room door behind her. Raphael took a few hesitant steps toward them. How did you know where we lived? Edward asked. Caleb gave me the address when we started planning the car sale. Raphael seemed nervous but determined. I had to come. After you left, my parents told me everything about Renata, about how I was almost adopted by you. You didn't know? Caleb asked, surprised. Raphael shook his head. I knew I was adopted, of course, but I didn't know the details, didn't know about the connection to your family. My parents always mentioned a Renata, who had been important in the adoption process, but they never made the full connection for me. Until today. Edward gestured to the sofa, inviting Raphael to sit. The young man accepted, looking relieved not to be immediately thrown out. When Caleb showed up at the Tomorrow House, Raphael continued, my parents found out through Dr. Ferrer. They were curious, but they decided not to interfere, to let things take their natural course. When they learned I had gotten close to Caleb, they were even more intrigued. I think they saw it as a kind of destiny. And when did the idea of the car come up? Edward asked, still trying to fit all the pieces together. It was a coincidence, at least initially, Raphael explained. My father is a real collector. When Caleb mentioned the Chevelle, describing it, I realized it was exactly the model my father had been looking for years. I suggested him as a potential buyer, never imagining the whole story behind it. But you knew the documents were forged, Edward accused. You knew Caleb was acting without my authorization. Raphael looked down, clearly ashamed. Yes, I was suspicious from the start. The story that you had authorized it but didn't want to be directly involved didn't make much sense. But Caleb was so persuasive and so passionate about the cause, and honestly, part of me wanted to believe it was possible, that it was the right thing to do. You took a big risk. Edward shook his head. You could lose your spot in law school if this came out. You could face criminal charges. I know. Raphael nodded gravely. I have no excuses for what I did. I can only say I was trying to help, even if it was in the wrong way. Edward studied the young man before him. It was strange to think that this young man could have been his son in another version of the story. There was something about him that was reminiscent of Renata. Perhaps the determination, perhaps the slightly reckless idealism. What did your parents say when they found out the truth? Edward asked. They were horrified, of course. Raphael gave a slight, embarrassed smile. My father immediately offered to undo the purchase, return the cars and put the whole situation behind us. But they also understood. Understood? I think they saw Renata's hand in it, somehow. As if she had planned it all, even though she's no longer here, a way to connect us, to complete the circle. Edward reflected on those words. It was too romantic a view for his pragmatic taste, but he couldn't deny that there was something almost supernatural about how events had unfolded, as if Renata, from somewhere born, was orchestrating this reunion. So now what? Caleb asked, looking from his father to Raphael. What happens? Edward sighed deeply. It was a complex question. Legally, he could undo the entire transaction, get the car back, even press charges against Raphael. But what good would that do? The money was already with the Tomorrow House, likely already being used to help the children. The car was with someone who clearly valued it and would take good care of it. And Raphael was part of their story now, in a way none of them could have imagined. I don't know exactly, he answered honestly, but I know I don't want any more secrets, no more distance between us. He looked meaningfully at Caleb. And I don't want to destroy what your mother helped build. Edward's phone rang, interrupting the moment. He checked the screen. It was Peter. Peter, any news? He answered, putting it on speaker. Mr. Martin. The assistant's voice sounded tense. I received a call from the IRS. There was an anonymous tip about the transfer to the Tomorrow House. They suspect money laundering due to the amount and the registered donor's age. They're opening a preliminary investigation. Edward felt his blood run cold. A new complication. Just when he thought things were starting to resolve. What exactly do they want to know? He asked, trying to stay calm. The origin of the money, the legitimacy of the transaction. They want to verify if there's any involvement of illicit activities. For now, it's just an administrative inquiry, but it could escalate into something more serious. Edward exchanged apprehensive glances with Caleb and Raphael. The situation had just become considerably more complex. I'll be at the office in an hour, he told Peter. Prepare all the documents related to the car, the sale, everything. I'm calling Dr. Morris right now. He hung up and immediately dialed his trusted lawyer. He briefly explained the situation, asking for urgent guidance. When he finished the call, Raphael and Caleb were looking at him with apprehensive expressions. Is it very serious? Caleb asked, his voice trembling. It could be, Edward answered truthfully. The IRS doesn't mess around. An investigation like this could affect not only our family, but also the Tomorrow House, the Campos family, everyone involved. Raphael stood up, looking determined. "I'll take full responsibility. It was my idea. I executed most of the plan. I can testify, explain everything." "No," Caleb interrupted, alarmed. "The idea was mine. You just helped me." Edward watched the interaction between the two, impressed by the bond they had formed in such a short time. There was something of brothers in their dynamic, in the way they tried to protect each other. "No one is going to sacrifice themselves," Edward decided. "We'll face this together, as a family. Because that's what we are now, isn't it? A strange, extended family, full of secrets and complications, but a family nonetheless." Raphael looked at Edward with surprise and something that seemed like gratitude. Caleb, in turn, impulsively hugged his father, something he hadn't done in a long time. "I'm going to the office to sort some things out," Edward continued. "Raphael, you go home. Explain the situation to your parents. We'll all meet tomorrow to decide how to proceed. Caleb, you stay here. No more adventures, no more secrets. Deal?" They both nodded, still visibly worried but seeming calmer under Edward's leadership. When Raphael left, Edward turned to his son. "I'm not going to lie, Caleb. What's ahead won't be easy, but we'll get through it together. And when it's all over, regardless of the outcome, we need to rebuild our relationship. No more distance, no more forbidden topics. I promise to talk more about your mother, about who she was, about what she did." Caleb nodded, his eyes welling up. "Thanks, Dad." On the way to the office, Edward reflected on the surreal events of the last 48 hours. He had lost a car, but perhaps he had gained something much more valuable, a new chance to connect with his son, to honor Renata's legacy, and maybe even to expand the meaning of family. The Chevelle, after all, was just an object, precious, laden with memories, but still just an object. What Renata had built at the Tomorrow House, in Raphael's life, in Caleb's heart, was infinitely more valuable. Arriving at his office, he found Peter and Dr. Morris already waiting for him. The lawyer's grave expression indicated that the situation was more serious than he had initially imagined. "The anonymous tip was quite specific," the lawyer explained, after the initial introductions. "It mentioned document fraud, signature forgery, possible extortion. Whoever did this knew details of the transaction." "Any idea who it could be?" Edward asked. Peter and the lawyer exchanged hesitant glances. "We received a call from your former sister-in-law, Mariana," Peter said finally. "She was furious, saying that Caleb had mentioned the car sale to her, the donation. I found her tone strange, as if she were personally offended." Edward closed his eyes, understanding. Mariana. Renata's sister had always had a complicated relationship with him, especially after Renata's death. She indirectly blamed him for her sister's passing, for his supposed emotional neglect in the last months of Renata's life. And now, upon discovering the sale of the Chevelle, the renewed connection with the Tomorrow House, she probably felt betrayed, excluded from the narrative. "Would she have reason to want to harm us?" the lawyer asked. "Perhaps not directly," Edward replied, "but Mariana has always been very protective of Renata's memory. If she thought we were using that memory in some improper way—" "Regardless of the informant," Dr. Morris interrupted, "we have a real problem on our hands. The IRS is investigating, and the suspicion of money laundering is serious. We need a clear strategy." Edward nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. How to protect Caleb, how to minimize the damage to the Tomorrow House, how to prevent Raphael from ruining his future over a thoughtless act. "What are our options?" he asked. "We can claim it was all a family misunderstanding," the lawyer suggested. "That you had verbally authorized the sale, but there was a communication breakdown regarding the legal procedures. That would explain the documentary failure without implying intentional forgery." "That would protect me, but it would place all the blame on Caleb and Raphael," Edward pondered. "I can't do that to them." "Another option would be to take full responsibility," Dr. Morris continued. "To say that you orchestrated the entire donation, using your son's name for tax reasons. It's risky, but it could protect the minors involved." Edward considered this possibility. It would be a blow to his reputation. He might even face tax fraud charges. But if it protected Caleb and Raphael— "And the third option?" he asked, suspecting there would be more. "Total transparency." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. We explain exactly what happened, with no omissions. Caleb acted impulsively, driven by the desire to honor his mother. Raphael helped him, recklessly. The Campos family bought the car in good faith. The Tomorrow House received the donation without knowledge of the irregularity. It's risky, but the truth has its own strength. Edward carefully weighed each option. Transparency could expose everyone to legal consequences, but lying or distorting the facts would only prolong the spiral of secrets that had already caused so much damage. We'll go with the truth, he finally decided. But first, I need to talk to all parties involved. Leonard and Vivian, Dr. Ferrer, Caleb and Raphael. Everyone needs to be aware of the risks and agree to this approach. Dr. Morris nodded, seeming to approve of the decision. We can schedule a meeting for tomorrow. The sooner we resolve this, the better. The next morning, the meeting room at Edward's company was full. Leonard and Vivian Campos had arrived punctually, as had Dr. Ferrer. Raphael was there with his adoptive parents, sitting discreetly in a corner. Caleb, next to his father, looked nervous but determined. Edward had spent a sleepless night preparing for this moment. It wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. When everyone was settled, he spoke. Thank you all for being here. We are gathered to discuss a delicate situation that affects us all. As you know, the IRS has received an anonymous tip and has opened an investigation into the donation made to the Tomorrow House. Apprehensive glances were exchanged around the room. Dr. Morris, sitting next to Edward, took over the technical aspect of the meeting, explaining the possible legal outcomes, the available options, and the risks involved. Our recommendation, the lawyer concluded, is to proceed with complete transparency, to explain exactly what happened, without omissions or distortions. Wouldn't that put Caleb and Raphael at risk? Vivian asked, concerned. There are risks, yes, Dr. Morris admitted, but we have some mitigating factors. Caleb's age, the noble purpose of the donation, the good faith of everyone involved. Furthermore, Mr. Martin is willing to take partial responsibility, citing negligence in safeguarding documents and passwords. Leonard Campos stood up, looking decisive. If I may, I'd like to make an alternative proposal. All eyes turned to the businessman. What if we legitimize the sale retroactively? I'll void the original purchase, returning ownership of the car to Edward. He then officially sells me the vehicle, and I make a new donation, in my name, of the same amount, to the Tomorrow House. Dr. Morris considered the proposal. That would resolve the issue of the current transaction's legitimacy, but it wouldn't erase the original act. The document forgery would still need to be explained. As for that, Dr. Ferrer intervened, we could claim it was a misunderstanding, that Caleb genuinely believed he was acting with his father's implicit authorization by continuing a project his mother had started. The discussion went on for hours. Every detail was analyzed, every risk assessed. In the end, they reached a plan of action that, while imperfect, seemed to offer the best chance of resolving the situation while minimizing damage for everyone involved. Leonard would void the original purchase and make a new one, this time with perfect documentation. The Tomorrow House would formally return Caleb's donation and accept a new one made by Leonard. Edward would provide clarification to the IRS, taking partial responsibility for supervisory failures that allowed a minor access to important documents. Caleb and Raphael would be protected as much as possible, though they would still need to give statements explaining their actions. As the meeting was about to end, there was an unexpected interruption. Peter entered hastily, holding his cell phone. Mr. Martin, forgive the interruption, but I think everyone needs to see this. He connected the phone to the room's projector and showed an online news page. The headline read, 12-year-old heir sells father's car to help orphanage. The entire room froze. The story had leaked to the press. Dr. Morris agreed gravely. Public pressure could influence how the case is handled. We have to act quickly. Edward tried to gather his thoughts. He needed to protect Caleb from media exposure, deal with the tax investigation, and now also with the public narrative being constructed. He felt cornered, but he knew he had to remain calm. I think we need to change our strategy, he said finally. We can no longer be on the defensive. What do you suggest? Dr. Morris asked. We get ahead of the story. Edward ran a hand through his hair, organizing his thoughts aloud. We'll give an exclusive interview, telling our version of the facts. No omissions, no distortions, but also without letting others control the narrative. The suggestion was met with mixed reactions. Dr. Ferrer seemed hesitant, worried about the additional exposure for the NGO. Leonard and Vivian exchanged apprehensive glances, clearly thinking about the impact this would have on Raphael. Raphael himself, however, surprised everyone. I agree with Mr. Martin, he said, standing up. If we remain silent, others will define who we are and what we did. We need to tell our own story. Caleb also spoke up. I want to participate. It was my idea, my action. I don't want to hide. Edward looked at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. Caleb, you're only 12. I can't let you expose yourself like this. Dad. Caleb met his father's gaze with determination. I'm already exposed. My picture is already in the news. I'd rather speak for myself than let others speak for me. The maturity of the argument left Edward momentarily speechless. Dr. Morris intervened. From a legal standpoint, we would need Mr. Martin's express permission for any interview involving Caleb. But I agree that controlling the narrative now could be strategic. The discussion continued for another hour. In the end, they reached a consensus. They would hold a carefully structured press conference. Edward would be the main spokesperson. Caleb could participate in a limited capacity, answering only pre-approved questions. The Tomorrow House would be represented by Dr. Ferrer, while Leonard would speak as the car's buyer. Raphael would stay out of it, protected by his status as a law student. Peter was tasked with contacting a trusted journalist, Marina Gaines, known for her ethical and balanced approach. The interview was scheduled for the next day, giving them time to prepare all the details. When the meeting ended, most of the participants left to handle their respective preparations. Edward, Caleb, and Raphael remained in the room, along with Dr. Morris. What about Mariana? Edward asked the lawyer. She's clearly behind the leak. Should we confront her? I wouldn't recommend it, Dr. Morris replied. Any contact now could be interpreted as intimidation. It's better to leave her out of it for now. Raphael seemed thoughtful. Maybe we should include her. What do you mean? Edward turned, surprised. Invite her to the interview, the young man explained. She clearly feels excluded from the narrative, from Renata's memory. If we bring her into the circle, instead of treating her as an adversary. Edward considered the suggestion. It was risky, but it could also be brilliant. Mariana was unpredictable, but she knew Renata better than anyone. If they could get her on their side, they could turn a potential enemy into an ally. I can try talking to her, Caleb offered. She's always been kind to me. Edward hesitated, but eventually agreed. All right, but I'll be present during the call. That evening at home, Edward watched Caleb prepare for the phone call. The boy looked nervous but determined. They sat together in the living room, with the phone on speaker. Mariana answered on the third ring. Caleb, is everything okay? Hi, Aunt Mariana. Caleb glanced at his father before continuing. I'm calling because, well, we saw the article in the news. We know you helped the journalist. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Your father is there with you, isn't he? Mariana's tone hardened. I am, Mariana, Edward intervened. And we're not calling to accuse or fight. We want to understand. Her voice went up an octave. 10 years, Edward, 10 years since Renata left us, and you've practically erased everything she stood for. Her work, the causes she championed. Even her photos were stored in the attic as if they were something to be ashamed of. Aunt Marie, Caleb interrupted gently. Dad didn't know about the Tomorrow House. Not like you think. He knew Mom did volunteer work, but he didn't know the details. And why didn't he ask? Mariana shot back. Why was he never interested? That place was your mother's second home, Caleb. She invested years of her life there, donated money, time, love. And after she passed, it was as if that part of her was buried along with her. Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the accusation. There was truth in it. Painful truth. You're right, he admitted, surprising both Mariana and Caleb. I failed. I failed to preserve that part of Renata, failed to share it with Caleb. But we're trying to change that now. By selling your father's car, Mariana's tone was skeptical. "By letting a 12-year-old boy take on a responsibility that should have been yours." "It was my choice," Caleb defended himself. "I wanted to do something that mattered, something Mom would approve of." There was another silence, this one longer. When Mariana spoke again, her voice was calmer. "You're a lot like her, you know, that idealism, that determination. Renata was like that. That's why we're calling," Edward resumed. "Tomorrow, we're giving an interview to tell our side of the story. We want you to participate. No one knew Renata better than you. No one can speak about her legacy with more authority." "Why would I do that?" Mariana asked, still suspicious. "Why would I help you after everything?" "It's not for us," Caleb replied. "It's for Mum. It's for the Tomorrow House, so that people understand why that place is important, why what we did, even if it was the wrong way, had a greater purpose." The ensuing silence felt charged with emotion. Finally, Mariana sighed. "I'll think about it. I'm not promising anything." When they hung up, Edward hugged his son, impressed by his maturity and eloquence. "You were incredible." "Do you think she'll accept?" Caleb asked, worried. "I don't know," Edward was honest, "but we've given her something to think about. It's the best we can do for now." The next morning, the conference room at the Four Seasons Hotel was set for the interview. Marina Gaines, the chosen journalist, arrived promptly with her team. Edward, Caleb, Dr. Ferrer, and Leonard were already positioned at the main table. Dr. Morris remained discreetly in the background, ready to intervene if necessary. There was no sign of Mariana. Just as everything was ready to begin, the back door opened. Mariana entered, elegant in a navy blue suit, carrying a folder. Her eyes met Edward's briefly before turning to Caleb, at whom she smiled tenderly. "May I join you?" she asked, gesturing to the table. Edward stood up immediately. "Of course. Please." The interview began in a structured manner. Marina gave an introduction to the case that had gained national attention, highlighting the main elements. A 12-year-old boy who sold his father's classic car to donate to an NGO where his late mother had been a volunteer. Edward was the first to speak, taking responsibility for his part in the situation. "I failed as a father by not realizing how much Caleb needed to know this part of his mother's story," he admitted. "I also failed by not being aware of the signs that something extraordinary was happening right under my nose." He explained the sentimental value of the Chevelle, how he discovered its disappearance, and the investigation that followed. He was honest about his initial feelings of anger and betrayal, but also about how his perspective changed upon understanding Caleb's motivations. Dr. Ferrer spoke next, providing context about the work of the Tomorrow House and Renata's contributions over the years. She explained how they received Caleb's donation, believing in the legitimacy of the documents presented. Leonard detailed his role as the buyer, emphasizing that he had acted in good faith and had already started the process to regularize the situation, voiding the original purchase and making a new one, this time with all legal procedures. When it was Caleb's turn, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The boy was visibly nervous, but he maintained an upright posture and a steady gaze. "I know that what I did was legally wrong," he began, his voice slightly trembling. "I shouldn't have forged documents. I shouldn't have gone behind my father's back. But finding those photos, those clippings about my mother's work, it was like discovering a part of her I never knew. I was only 2 when she passed. I don't have my own memories of her, only the stories I've been told." Caleb paused, glancing briefly at Mariana, who nodded encouragingly. "When I got to know the Tomorrow House, when I saw the impact her work still had on that place, I felt I had to do something significant, something she would approve of. The Chevelle was the most valuable thing we could donate, something that truly represented a sacrifice. I knew my father would never agree. The car was his last connection to my grandfather. That's why I acted alone. It was wrong, but I don't regret the purpose. Only the way I did it." Caleb's maturity and eloquence visibly impressed the journalist. When Mariana began to speak, her tone was very different from the resentment she had shown on the phone the previous night. "Renata dedicated herself, body and soul, to social causes," she explained. "She believed that privilege came with responsibility. When we saw the news about what Caleb had done, I was overcome with conflicting emotions. On one hand, pride in seeing my nephew follow in his mother's footsteps. On the other, anger at the thought that Edward had never properly valued this aspect of my sister's life. She looked directly at Edward before continuing. I now realize I was unfair. Everyone deals with grief in their own way. Edward preserved Renata in his own fashion by protecting and raising their son. And Caleb, even without his own memories of his mother, managed to capture her essence through this gesture. Mariana then opened the folder she had brought and took out some old photographs. I brought these to share, she said, handing the photos to the journalist. They are records of Renata's work at the Tomorrow House, of projects she started that continue to this day, of children she helped who are now successful adults. This is the true legacy she left, and which Caleb, in his own way, is helping to preserve. The interview continued for another hour. They talked about the IRS investigation, the plans to regularize the situation, and the impact the donation would have on the NGO's projects. Marina asked direct but fair questions, allowing each person to explain their point of view. At the end, she asked the question everyone was expecting. And what about the Chevelle? What will happen to it now? Edward looked at Leonard, then at Caleb, before answering. The car will formally return to my ownership as part of voiding the irregular sale. Then I will make a new legitimate sale to Leonard. The proceeds will be donated to the Tomorrow House, as was Caleb's original intention, but with one important difference. It will be a joint donation in the name of the Martin family, honoring Renata's legacy. Marina smiled discreetly, seeming to approve of the solution. When the interview ended, the journalist assured them she would publish a balanced story the next day, presenting all aspects of the story. It's an extraordinary narrative, Marina commented as she packed her equipment. A 12-year-old boy who sells a valuable car to help a noble cause, following in his late mother's footsteps, the discovery of unexpected family connections, reconciliations. It has all the elements of a great story of overcoming adversity. In the days that followed, Marina's report had a surprising impact. What had started as a potential image crisis turned into an inspiring story that captured the public's imagination. Other media outlets picked up the story, expanding on it with additional interviews, reports on the work of the Tomorrow House, and profiles on Renata and her legacy. The positive response had concrete effects. The IRS, sensitive to the human context of the case and the steps taken to regularize the situation, decided to close the investigation after the formal submission of the corrected documentation. Leonard completed the new purchase of the Chevelle, this time with all legal procedures. The Tomorrow House received not only the promised donation, but also additional contributions from people touched by the story. A week after the interview, Edward visited the Tomorrow House for the first time. Caleb accompanied him, proud to finally show his father the place that had become so significant to him. Dr. Ferrer guided them through the space, explaining the different projects, introducing the children, and telling stories from the time Renata worked there. When they reached the annex named after Renata, the cultural space built with her original donation, Edward felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in a long time. On the walls were photographs of Renata with the children. In a corner, a small plaque with a quote from her. Art is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Every child deserves beauty in their life. She used to say that all the time, Dr. Ferrer commented with a nostalgic smile. When some questioned why we should invest in art for children with unmet basic needs, Renata argued that feeding the soul was as important as feeding the body. Edward nodded, recognizing his wife's philosophy in those words. Renata had always been like that, pragmatic in some respects, idealistic in others, a combination he had deeply loved. As they left the institution, they found Raphael waiting at the gate. In recent days, the young man had become a constant presence in their lives. The revelation that he had almost been adopted by Edward and Renata had created an unexpected bond between them. How was the visit? Raphael asked, greeting them with a smile. Incredible, Caleb replied, excited. Dad got emotional in Mum's cultural space. Edward didn't deny it. It had been a powerful experience, like reconnecting with a part of Renata he had never truly known or properly appreciated. Do you have plans for the rest of the day? Raphael asked. My parents would like to invite you for dinner. They think we have a lot to talk about, many stories to share. Edward hesitated briefly. The idea of a dinner with Leonard and Vivian, discussing what might have been if Renata had lived, if they had adopted Raphael, it was emotionally complex, but also, strangely, comforting. "It would be our pleasure," he finally accepted. As they walked to the car, Edward reflected on the extraordinary events of the past few weeks. He had lost an object of sentimental value, but had gained something infinitely more precious, a new understanding of Renata's legacy, a deeper connection with his son, and the unexpected expansion of the concept of family. The Chevelle was now with Leonard, who promised to care for it with the same affection and preserve its history. But the real treasure, Edward now realized, was what Renata had built in her lifetime, in the people she touched, the causes she championed, and the son she raised, however briefly. That evening, at dinner with the Campos family, the stories flowed naturally. Vivian shared memories of Renata that Edward had never heard. Leonard showed photographs of Raphael growing up, milestones that Edward and Caleb had missed. Raphael and Caleb discovered, with delight, that they had much in common, despite the different paths their lives had taken. In a quiet moment, while the others were talking animatedly, Vivian approached Edward with a serious expression. "Renata came to see me a week before the accident," she revealed in a low voice. "She said she was gathering the courage to tell you about Michael, Raphael, that she couldn't bear to keep that secret any longer." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "What do you think would have happened if she had told me?" Vivian smiled gently. "I think we would have found a way. Maybe Raphael would have grown up knowing you, having two families instead of one. Maybe Caleb would have had the chance to grow up as an older brother. It's strange to think about what could have been." Edward looked at the two young men, now laughing at some shared joke. "But look at what is," Vivian replied, following his gaze. "They found each other anyway, in a way that none of us could have predicted or planned." Edward nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. Life had its own plans, its own winding paths. Sometimes it took an impulsive act, like selling a car without permission, to reveal buried truths and create new possibilities. In the months that followed, many things changed in the Martins' lives. Edward became a member of the advisory board of the Tomorrow House, contributing his business expertise to strengthen the institution's financial management. Caleb began to participate regularly in volunteer activities, developing drawing workshops for the younger children. Raphael, finishing his law degree, decided to specialize in child and youth law, inspired by his own story. Mariana, surprisingly, also grew closer. Years of resentment gave way to a respectful relationship, united by the common desire to honor Renata's memory. Together, Edward and Mariana established a scholarship in Renata's name, intended for young people from the Tomorrow House who wished to pursue careers in the arts. One Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after the events that had transformed their lives, Edward, Caleb, Raphael, Leonard, Vivian, and Mariana gathered at the Martins' penthouse for a celebratory lunch. The Tomorrow House had just inaugurated a new wing, built with part of the fund established by the family, and everyone had attended the ceremony the day before. During the meal, Leonard surprised everyone with an announcement. "I have a special gift," he said, handing a small package to Edward. Inside the box was a key and a photograph. The key belonged to the Chevelle. The photograph showed the car, fully restored and more beautiful than ever, parked in front of the Tomorrow House. "The car belongs to your story," Leonard explained. "We decided it should stay with the Martin family, not as property, but as a symbol of what you have built together." Edward looked at Caleb, who seemed as surprised as he was. The boy, now 13, smiled and nodded, understanding the meaning of the gesture. "Thank you." Edward shook Leonard's hand, genuinely touched. "But I think the Chevelle has found its rightful place with you. What I propose is that it remains in your collection, but that once a year, on Renata's birthday, we all take it together to the Tomorrow House, to remember how it all began." The suggestion was met with unanimous approval. It wasn't just about a car, but about what it had represented and continued to represent: connection, legacy, family. Later, after the guests had left, Edward found Caleb in his room, drawing as he often did. He watched his son for a few moments, marveling at his concentration, his creativity, at everything he was and promised to become. "What are you working on?" he asked, approaching. Caleb showed him the drawing. It was the Chevelle, but not alone. In the drawing, the car was surrounded by people: Edward, Caleb, Raphael, the Campos family, Mariana, Dr. Ferrer, and in the sky, like an ethereal presence, Renata watched over them all with a smile. "It's our family," Caleb explained simply. "The one we chose." Edward hugged his son, feeling a profound gratitude for the wisdom of this child who, through an impulsive yet deeply significant act, had transformed loss into connection and loneliness into community. The Chevelle was no longer just a car, an object of material and sentimental value. It was the symbol of an unexpected journey that had led them to rediscover the meaning of family, the importance of legacy, and the transformative power of a gesture moved by love. And Renata, somehow, remained present in all of them, in Caleb's idealism, in Raphael's determination, in the work of the Tomorrow House, and now, finally, in Edward's reconciled heart as well. Not as a painful absence, but as an inspiring presence that continued to guide them, even after so many years.